Hey, I'm feeling great. I'm sitting next to an Italian and on the right side of the panel, so I'm very comfortable.
You got a problem with that?
No, I'm great. So I got just three short things I want to say before I jump into this. The first one is I wanted to thank you. I'm an outsider. You guys are doing the Lord's work, and I'm not here to criticize or anything. I appreciate what you do. I honor what you do. I've been through what you do, and it's incredibly important. And from an American citizen, thank you for who you are and what you do. It's awesome. And the second thing I wanted to say is, look, I spend 99% of my time in Washington talking about how what we're doing to the Army is really stupid, bordering on criminal. And that's my day job. But that wasn't what I was asked here. So I'm going to talk about the 1% of how you deal with this. And the reality is and many times we've been through this, the truth is we spend 99% of our time in the leadership fixating on the two things that the leadership really can impact, and that is how much money you get and the size of the force. And the reality is when you focus on the things you actually can impact, you do have a dramatic effect. And there's a great book on this. If anybody has a chance to read, it's called Kevlar Legions. It's a terrific book that looks through the Army's ups and downs and really finishes by focusing on looking through the experience of the downsizing in the 90s. And what really comes through is, if you do deal across that spectrum, there are places where you really can make a dramatic impact, regardless of the size of the force and how much money you had. And if people really follow through in some of the themes we discussed here, I think that's exactly right. And I'll just lift what I saw as the top 5 just very, very quickly, and then focus on what it has to do with this panel. The first one is clearly values. When the Army returns to its roots and seriously discusses and focuses on and goes and deals with the values and its core purpose, that always brings it through the toughest times. It's the most important thing you do. The second one is leadership. You can never spend enough time talking about leadership in the down periods, particularly as you look at leaders in transition being from warriors into a peacetime force. The third one is doctrine. It's not the doctrine you produce, it's the intellectual conversation that you generate with the doctrine that really, really matters, particularly in times of transition and down. These are all really fundamentally human capital issues, and they really are the top and the most important ones where you see historically where the Army really has had an enormously powerful impact in terms of driving its ability to deal with the future. Just to touch on the other two very quickly, the fourth one is experimental forces. Experimental forces have always been critical to the development of the Army. You cannot have a great turning point in our history when they have not played a pivotal role, and yet, almost without question, we immediately cut those out of the force in the downsizing to save space for other things. And it's the biggest mistake we made, that we don't sustain the experimental forces through the front end of the downside period. And the fourth one is acquisition. And I'll just spend a minute focusing on this one because I think it's the one that's most relevant to the panel. Okay, the reality is we always show up at the battlefield with the wrong stuff. The reality is we always ad hoc a procedure for getting the stuff we need. And the reality is when the war is over, we take everything we learned in ad hocing it and we ignore it. And then we go back to a formal acquisition process. That is the reality of what we always do. I'm confident we'll do it again. But the truth is when you sit down and you say, do you need a formal acquisition process or do you need a rapid acquisition process? The answer is yes. You need both. They need to coexist and live side by side. And I've been through this and I understand all the troubles and challenges of doing that and the headaches and everything else. But the reality is if you want to be best prepared for battle, you have to maintain both systems. And it's maintaining that rapid acquisition process in the downtime that is the greatest challenge. And it just seems kind of oxymoron to say institutionalize innovation, but I mean that's essentially what you're doing. So if somebody asks me, Jim, if we're going to do this, what are you really talking about? There really are 4 essential components to this. And the first is you have to have a data collection and feedback system. If you don't have a way to rapidly sense the environment and interpret that, and then to develop a realistic requirement, you can't get there from here. And that's got to be built in at the front end. The second is you have to have access to the global innovation and industrial base. You're never going to do this as efficiently and efficaciously as possible if you limit yourself to even within industrial sectors in the United States, but it really is access to what's available globally. The third is even in the most rapid acquisition thing, you still need an RDT&E process. And then the fourth one, which is the one everybody acknowledges, this is the one we always screw up, but yet it's the one we always screw up, is there has to be a training and sustainment piece on the back end of rapid acquisition. If there wasn't, it's usually just Conex-ware, right? So we all know those things, but if you don't have all four of those pieces, you don't have a rapid acquisition process, right? And so how, if you said, okay, yeah, I want to be different than every army we've ever had, and I actually want to sustain rapid acquisition, so when the next war starts up, I'm not ad hocing how I'm learning and innovating on the battlefield, what would I do? And I would just outline just from past experience, what I would see as a 5-step roadmap. Number one is you're actually in very good shape. And that is to document the lessons learned on the experiences that we've seen this last year. I mean, they're the only ones that are really, truly relevant. How we've done rapid acquisition in World War II and everything else is quite honestly, the only thing that's really relevant is the experience of the last 4 or 5 years. That needs to be captured and documented. And then I think the second step is you got to do kind of a proof of principle or pilot process. You have to come up with a test case to show how this is going to work and sustain in peacetime and survive the bureaucracy and everything else. And the third thing you've got to do is you've got to broadly engage stakeholders, particularly in the Capitol Hill, to educate and institutionalize and socialize people to accept this thing and allow it to live. The fourth thing is you have to have a legislative foundation for this. An innovative process that doesn't have a legislative foundation going forward is never going to endure. And then the fifth one I think is the most challenging, the most innovative, and potentially the most really exciting, which is you can't put the process on the shelf. You actually have to use it and practice it and run it. Whether you're basing off of innovation from a recent training cycle or innovation based on some experience NATO had in Libya or something else, but you have to, in a sense, actually run the traps. And that doesn't mean you have to actually buy anything, but you have to run the traps. And I think, particularly with the advances we've made in simulation and modeling and the ability to do rapid prototyping, there is a capacity, in a sense, to run this thing to make sure it's greased and works. So when you have to ramp up for the wartime, you're set to go. So with that comment, I will turn it over to smarter people.
I don't know about that. Thank you, Jim, very much. I'd like to talk about 3 things today, and they all are important to investing in the Army's generating force. 3 thoughts for you. The first is that the world's finest Army needs the world's finest capabilities factory. And that's how I think about the generating force, as the Army's capabilities factory. You need that capabilities factory to sustain the force and also to prepare it to meet emerging challenges. I think General Green yesterday mentioned the new Defense Strategic Guidance. It was mentioned this morning also. It describes what some of those new challenges are going to be. And it describes really what the services need to be prepared to do in their generating force, or whatever they call their institutions, to adapt to them. And that includes protecting the ability to regenerate capabilities to meet unforeseen demands, maintaining intellectual capital and rank to expand key elements of the force, and I think General Perkins spoke about that a few moments ago, and also rebuilding readiness in areas that, by necessity, were de-emphasized over the past decade. To support these directives, the Army may actually need to increase its investment in the generating force. With that, I'd like my first chart. As one important measure, one can look at the active duty generating force end strength and see that it's actually declined as the generating force has increased the size of its operating force. Historically, about 25% of the Army's in the generating force, another 12% are in the TTHS accounts, which of course includes the recruits. And you can see that at the same time the Army is growing its operating end strength, it actually was by necessity shrinking its generating force. And it may be now we have the opportunity and actually the need to reverse that to some extent, or as General Cohn said, to re-green the institutional Army. Next chart, please. There's another interesting point. When one uses the term generating force or institutional Army, one has the impression that these are soldiers that day in and day out are really spending their time, many, many hours a week, generating the operational force. And to a large extent that's true, but I'd like to point out that about half of the generating force, by my quick examination, actually is involved day in and day out in joint missions and national activities. That includes the soldiers out at Fort Meade working with the NSA. That includes the soldiers from the 163rd that will be deploying soon, a TDA outfit as it's termed. Will be deploying soon to Afghanistan. It also includes all the joint duty officers. As an interesting vignette, If you're an Army officer, if you are in a joint command, even if you're the combatant commander, you're actually accounted for as the Army generating force. So the operational combatant commander is actually in a UIC that is a TDA UIC. It's accounted for in the generating force, but I'm very certain that that actually is as close to the operation as one can get. So again, about half of the generating force actually are doing things every day that have a direct national contribution. Last chart. The third thing I'd like to just mention is that actually the Army is efficient. When one looks at, if one looks at the Defense Manpower Requirements Report, and one looks at the number of soldiers that are book kept within what, again, the DMRR calls infrastructure, that would include, in the case of the Army, the generating force and the TTHS accounts, the Army actually has the lowest percentage in these accounts of any of the services. And so the thing that's key here is that the Army actually generates the largest force with a small percentage of manpower in its generating force in TTHS. So with that little bit of data, I would like to close here. I'll look forward to questions and like to turn it over to Dr. Markell.